Greetings, this is Griff Ruby, the Nostalgic Catholic, with another Asimov book review, this time being The Stars Like Dust. You see here the original Doubleday hardback edition of the Isaac Asimov, with the cover design by Whitney Bender, who you can see actually signed it right there. Look at that. I wonder how many people ever noticed that. So, you've got this ship flying through space. There's the stars you can see in this side. Oh, there we go, on this side here. And then all these cloudy areas, the nebula, like a big pile of dust. So, that's supposed to be the Horsehead Nebula, by the way. Named after the first person to go there and explore it, Horace Head. Well, it actually floats that idea, because that far in the future, who knows? So, but this is, of course, one of his Galactic Era novels. It's actually the second of his Galactic Era novels. I do it probably as these recordings first, because it is, I think, my favorite of the three Galactic Era novels. So they're all very close together. I like all three of them. But if I had to name a favorite among them, it would be this one. So, The Stars Like Dust is a really enjoyable adventure. I've liked it. I always have. Because it's full of all those adventures and twists and turns and everything. There's a nice little love affair, too, between the main guy, Byron Farrell, and the daughter of the director of the planet Rhodia, Artemisia, who's, well described and even well portrayed. So, unlike the Foundation books, these Galactic Era novels, including Stars Like Dust, were originally published by Doubleday. The first of them, Pebble in the Sky, was Asimov's very first book sale of any kind to any publisher. And later that year, he got iRobot on the Gnome Press. And meanwhile, once Pebble in the Sky was clearly showing to be the success, it didn't take any time for them to sort of contract out to him, we'd like another book like this. And so he wrote The Stars Like Dust. There was a bit of a story going on here, because he was also getting stories published in Galaxy Science Fiction. And the agreement between himself, his publisher Doubleday, and the magazine writers, in this case of Galaxy, Horace Gold, its editor, was that Horace Gold would get the first draft of his manuscript and publish it. And then afterwards, Doubleday, well, they'd probably be working more or less concurrently, but it just takes more time to bring out a book than a magazine, would also take his manuscript, change a little bit, have him change a little bit, whatever they need to do, make it more like a real book, and publish the book. And yes, there are textual differences, too many to recount. Most of them very small differences. I'll illustrate a few. Some of the differences are somewhat larger, and I'll point to a few of those as well. But at any rate, the Galaxy magazine was able to have these stories actually already printed, or at least one or two of them, before the end of 1950, even though the magazine dates start with January 1951. And there it says, Tyran by Isaac Asimov. And there's a scene from there. This is one of the guards, or it could be Byron himself, I'm not sure which, experiencing these weird shapes around him, because this gentleman over here, in the red, is Gilbert Oth Henriad. He is the brother of the director of the planet Rhodia, Hendrik von Henriad, or Hendrik Oth Henriad. And you also see here This here being the daughter of Artemisia. Okay. And he's got something that even turns up in the Foundation itself. The Visisoner, a strange sort of quasi-musical instrument that reaches directly into the brain and causes it to see all kinds of strange images and other things like that. We'll talk about it a little bit later on because there's some interesting variations that happen in the textual in the text. But anyway, so that's a scene from there, which is in this particular part 1. Part 2 shows up in the February 1951 Galaxy, which is also famous. Perhaps one day I may review this for containing The Fireman by Ray Bradbury, which is an early draft of Fahrenheit 451. Very famous stuff there. So, and then the third and part conclusion of the story, that it was serialized, went into the March 1951 edition of Galaxy Science Fiction. So these 3 magazines here, therefore, comprise, in my opinion, the way I see things, the true first edition of The Stars Like Dust, albeit under the title of Tyran by Isaac Asimov, because there's these beings known as Tyran and Tyranni. Now, the Tyranni, it wasn't clear when he wrote them whether they were meant to be just a particular race of humans that were kind of short and obnoxious, or maybe some different quasi others, not quite human, other species, but close enough to human to possibly interbreed with them. So it was not really clear. Kind of reminds me of the Lazino we met in his Black Friar of the Flame novelette published in Planet Stories, almost barely before the first publication of the first Foundation installment in Astounding. So that's the first real edition. Then, of course, Doubleday came out with their edition here. So that's what they had. Now, that said, the story was pretty cool because there's a lot of intrigues going on here. He starts in this room, woken up with a radiation bomb. It starts on Earth, interestingly enough. Pebble in the Sky also began on Earth, but it just started with this old tailor who was age 62, and he'd had a good life and could probably retire if he hadn't already, and happily married, owned his home, his kids were grown and had their own careers, and life had been good to him, and he was hoping things would continue that way. He worried about the nuclear bomb or atomic bomb, more about that distinction a bit, but he was hoping and trusting in the general goodness of humanity that this wouldn't ever actually happen. As we speak now, that still hasn't, so I guess he had enough to be happy about, certainly for himself personally, and without doubt his children. But that was that story. And suddenly, through some weird, freaky thing, he gets transported way into the future. Well, this one also starts on Earth, but now this is an Earth kind of similar to the Earth that's actually seen in Pebble in the Sky. An Earth where there had been radioactive, atomic wars, nuclear power war, bombs set off all over the place. There's radiation-filled areas that you're not supposed to go because it'll zap you. And you won't live very long. I mean, this is for your protection. And also, another curious feature is buildings obviously designed to handle nuclear blasts. Thick, concrete, lead-lined buildings, that if you set off a bomb practically right on top of them, the people inside would be safe. So that had become the style of building. And even though the wars are now in the remote past, apparently such buildings are still the norm for Earth. And Byron Farrell starts out in Earth, waking up one morning to discover that there's A, he can't get out of his room, B, the lights are out, and C, there's a bomb, a radiation bomb of some sort in his room that could explode. Well, we meet another character there who's named Sandor Jonti, and Sandor Jonti, well, gets him out of the situation and says, okay, there's a lot of stuff going on. Your father has just been killed by the tyranny, and you need to get somewhere. And here's what you should do. You should go see director Henry of the of Rhodia. Well, you just need to go there. Don't question it. And his life having been closely threatened, he goes to that. He gets to Rhodia. The tyranny arrests him. They decide to let him see Henry, and turns out they believe there may be some big plot. Yes, there's a big plot, and they want to track it down. And I think he may be a part of it. Well, not really. His father has kind of kept him out of it all, and it's not ever clear exactly how much his father did know about it. So, but at any rate, they figured if we follow these characters, maybe they'll lead us right to the characters. Because the father had carefully kept his distance from anybody, and all they got was him. But, I mean, presumably, it was thought there might be this whole big world that was gearing up for a massive war against the tyranny. And the tyranny, of course, obviously wanted to nip that one in the bud. So, the adventures pertain to that. We have a Samach Aratap, who is the chief tyranny we deal with most of the time. And he's an interesting character. I mean, clearly he's one of the bad guys, but he's also kind of a sympathetic figure, in a way. So, somewhat sympathetic, as tyranny go. And I won't spoil the book with all of the good stuff, but I think it might be fair enough to discuss two other versions of the manuscript. There is, of course, the original published in the Pages of Galaxy. Then there's the original book on Doubleday. And then the Ace was given the paperback rights, and they published it as the Rebellious Stars. Sadly, I really can't be certain that this image on the front matches anything in the story that I can identify. It might be when they're on a planet where they just uninhabited planet, where they're looking for the rebel world or something, and it's not there. But they're looking for, pretending to, while other story events more important are actually going on as to why they're landing, and taking a little walk away from the spacecraft to put some radio equipment fairly late in the story. And so, but I can't totally relate it to this picture. And Asimov was really angry about this, but let's talk about some of the other resentments. Now, Isaac Asimov tells the story of one of the things that happened was that Horace Gold, the editor of Galaxy, had this idea: you should find some way to insert the American Constitution into this story. And Asimov's like, come on, I'm thousands and thousands of years in the future. What's the American Constitution going to be at that time? An ancient relic? I mean, lots of places have constitutions. What's the big deal? And, an understandable perspective, now that we've seen a few more constitutions come and go from other countries, we begin to realize something. It's now actually by far the oldest original constitution still in effect. So I think that's kind of an interesting aspect that probably wasn't so widely known or thought of. So I don't blame him for not having figured that fact out. Because unlike other constitutions that would be created and destroyed every time a regime change took place, this has managed to continue, and so forth. It's had a number of amendments, but there's a real continuity from the original to what it is today, and hopefully for as long as it stays in effect. It's proved to be an extraordinarily durable and carefully thought out document, and despite that, it still required amendments, some of which probably weren't all that necessary. I mean, in one case, one had to be directly destroyed, repealed basically by a later one. Although even that could be seen as having had some value. And he didn't want to put that in there, but Horace Gold insisted, I want the American Constitution in your story. So he wove it in the draft with the idea that, okay, I'll put it in there for your Galaxy magazine version of it, but I'll rip it out for the Doubleday edition. But Brad of Doubleday said, oh no, I like that. Keep it. And Asimov was like, no, look, keep it. It's really good. And I have to admit, I agree with Brad and with Horace Gold. It's a nice thing. It's, but that already put this in a bad odor with him. They tweaked my story. They forced me to do this thing that I really didn't want to put in here. And but I think it kind of it does unify the story in a very real way. It takes this name Tyran from the Tyranny beings, a story about tyranny. They were oppressing about 50 worlds that they controlled in a section of the galaxy near the Horsehead Nebula. And meanwhile, we have the Autarch of Lingane, and he wanted to become an Autarch of the whole 50 worlds. And, all you do is, if you overthrow the Tyranny, you just replace them with somebody else, and nothing ever changes. How do you get to something new? Of course, that's what the idea of the Constitution. It involved in some way the general run of the populace. Okay. So, which I think actually does make a nice, unifying concept, even though it's thousands and thousands of years later. Here's this weird old artifact from Earth, and they still remember at this point in time that Earth is where humanity started. So time will come. Well, we must have started somewhere, but we're not sure anymore. But at this point, it's still well known and understood that Earth is where everything started, but everything had expanded from there. So anyway, when Ace came out with their edition, which apparently Isaac did not see until about early 1955, actually, he checked it over. He was in the habit of reading everything that gets published to see how it is. And he's going through it, and a lot of it just doesn't seem to make sense. He does some comparisons, and he finds chunks of it just cut out here and there. And the most extreme case of that is Chapter 5 is clean missing. In fact, all the chapters after that get renumbered. So what was Chapter 6 in the original editions becomes Chapter 5 in the Ace version. And what was 7 becomes 6, and so on, until it all ends. Instead of Chapter 22 everywhere else, it's Chapter 21 in the Ace version. Oh, and Ace actually included this as part of a double novel with some other story here. The Earth Gone Mad by, who is this? Roger G. Also complete and unabridged. It said this was complete and unabridged here at the bottom. But it was not complete or unabridged. And that really pissed him off. He said, that's it. I'm not dealing with Ace anymore. They got pretty mad at them. And he'd also put a couple of Foundation novels and had done similar things. So he dealt with other publishers for quite a while. Avon got their act together years later, but at the time he was really annoyed with them. The final edition came out in 1982, and I don't know if it had a hardback for this. This is the paperback at that time, and the changes are very slight. I can think of 3 in particular, and maybe other incidental things that I don't remember. One of them was that we went from atomic to nuclear. In fact, at one point, this mentions an atomic pile. Now, in 1950, everyone knew about atomic piles because the atomic pile came even before the atomic bomb as a way of generating power. Enrico Fermi was experimenting with that as early as 1941. And it was a pile because it had all these piles of different things, and concrete this and cadmium that, and of course the uranium rods, the cadmium control rods, and the uranium fissioning material, and you could control this thing and have a real controlled nuclear reaction. Very amazing stuff. And then later on, they figured out how to do an uncontrolled one that would be a bomb. Manhattan Project, World War II, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, kaboom. Okay. So, but it just becomes a nuclear bomb in the 1982 edition. Things that are called atomic get called nuclear. One other difference, for some reason, in the original book, well, Gilbreth Othunria, the brother of Henrik, had this habit of wanting to listen in on things, and they called it sounding. He could sound this, which was okay. That's how they put it, so that he could hear what people were saying in different rooms of the palace, the royal palace, where he and his brother or other family members and various dignitaries either lived and or worked or held their offices, etc. And he could listen in on stuff, but he called it sounding. In this edition, it becomes tapping, which I guess in 1950, 51, that would have sounded tapping. No. Tapping like tapping a phone, tapping a wire, tapping a connection, tapping in on a flow of communication. So sounding becomes tapping. Then the third one I can think of is when it's describing the dust of the Horsehead Nebula. In the originals, it actually is indicating, well, there's sodium ions and calcium and there are different various metals and things that might comprise that dust. In the new, they just had dust. They weren't going to get into particular elements. It's not relevant to the story at all. So they kind of cleaned that up, or somebody cleaned that up. I don't know. Asimov may have owned it himself, going through some of these things. I don't know. So those are basically the 4 different texts. That's the biggest one for the biggest differences, those little corrections for how things are said. But I want to show a couple of differences here just to showcase some of the things, because I think it's really kind of interesting to have these different editions. Now, the first one, this appears on page 41 of the Galaxy. This is actually somewhere in the chapter 5 that the 8th edition omitted altogether. Artemisia is about to be forcibly married to some Tirani dignitary, and she doesn't want to be married. These guys are disgusting, they're horrible, they're oppressors, and furthermore, they have bad breath. And she's commenting on that, the Tirani are led by their leader called the Khan, K-A-H-N, like the Wrath of Khan. Okay. So Henrik spread his hands wide and let them drop. Arta, the man is the Tyranian, and a powerful one. He is in good odor at the Khan's court. And she comes up, the Khan might think it's a good odor. He probably would. He must smell even worse. Maybe that is how they judge rank, by rankness. Henrik's mouth was an horror. Okay. For the Doubleday edition, and all later editions, the new one did not change this. And that would be on 55 of the original hardback. It's worded a little differently. That nice little pun about rank and rankness was for some reason stripped out. Okay. So, where is this one? Arta, the man is a Tyranian, and a powerful one. He is in good odor at the Khan's court. And she comes out. The Khan might think it's a good odor. He probably would. He probably stinks himself. Henrik's mouth was an horror. That whole bit about rank, this is how they measure rank. Gone. And the thing is, it's full of little changes like that. I'll give you another one, however. Now, this would be on page 43 of the original Tyrani edition of Galaxy Magazine 43. Now, talking about some of the different architecture, a little world building here. Okay, so he has a little description here. Widemos Hall, where he, Byron Farrell, had grown up, had been beautiful in his eyes, and now his memory endowed it with a merely barbaric glitter. Its curved lines, its filigree work, its curiously wrought turrets, its elaborate false windows, he winced at the thought of them. Earth was mellower. Remember, this is the Earth thing where buildings are built like nuclear shelters. Earth was mellower, but it was minute and dreamy. The public buildings had been of white, glossy stone, the private homes of plastic nearstone in pastel shades. The net effect had been one of gingerbread and sugar candy. It was a toy world. But this was different. The palace grounds of Rhodia was no mere lump of ostentation built by petty lords of a cattle kingdom, nor was it the childlike expression of a fading and dying world. It was the culmination in stone of the Henriad dynasty. Now, let's see what the Doubleday edition did with that. Page 58. I wrote these things down so I don't have to look for them too much. I hate having to do that. Okay. Alright. Widemos Hall, where he'd grown up, had been beautiful in his eyes, and now his memory endowed it with a merely barbaric glitter. Its curved lines, its filigree work, its curiously wrought turrets, its elaborate false windows, he winced at the thought of them. But this was different. The palace grounds of Rhodia were no mere lump of ostentation built by the petty lords of a cattle kingdom, nor were they the childlike expression of a fading and dying world. Oops, a little reference to Earth was still in there. They were the culmination in stone of the Henriad dynasty. Still seems a little bit back. And that whole section about the Earth, gone by the time we got to Doubleday's version. So, another one here. Okay. Now, page 53. I've sent the busy sonner. Let's take a look at this. Now, there's all these different imageries that the busy sonner that Gilbert is using and demonstrating to Byron. So, he's trying to artwork this thing, but he doesn't know all of what it could do. It could do things no one would ever do with simple sound or sight. I lack the capacity for it, I'm afraid. However, just a light this is all new. However, just a light touch, not enough to confuse the established mental patterns, is sometimes rather interesting. It heightens perception, releases the psychological censor, accentuates wishful thinking or expectant dread. He moved the knobs minutely before Byron could object. The moaning now was sweet cerebral music, which for an instant threatened to become hollowly menacing before Byron thought of Arta. He thought of her, and she was real against the background of the room and Gilbert with the box of greens in his hand. The music rose to hungry longing more intense than any emotion Byron had ever experienced. She was beautiful, and he wanted her. It ended, and she was gone. He stood with his fists tight and his heart beating in a race rhythm. Gilbert looked hastily down at the sonovisor as though embarrassed by the intensity of Byron's visible yearning. He should have been amused, yet he was not, and Byron, relaxing unhappily, was grateful for that. I suppose it could have great therapeutic value, said Gilbert, by revealing to us our suppressed wishes and fears. Byron just gets more serious. I'd like to ask you a question, Byron said abruptly. By all means. Why don't you put your scientific ability to worthwhile use? Okay, now that whole big section is edited way down for the Doubleday edition, and that would be in page 58. So, no, 69. Okay, that makes sense. Okay. Okay. Sometimes I think if one could really study this thing, one could compose symphonies in a new medium. do things one could never do with simple sound or mind. I lack the capacity for it, I'm afraid. Okay, now, Byron said abruptly, I'd like to ask you a question. By all means, why don't you put your scientific ability to worthwhile use? So all that other stuff, seeing Artemisia, having a longing for her in this vision, being left feeling gutted of all this experience when Gilbert stopped playing the instruments. Gone. Okay, that's pretty huge. Now, let's take a look at some other differences. As I said, the second line here, pages 137, 138. Now, all right, there's a whole extra explanation here. Okay, now they're writing he has stolen, borrowed, whatever you want to call it, the Tyrannian cruiser, the one that Asimov Aerotap had been using, by the way. That's what he decided to do. And he's on there. He's taking Gilbert and Artemisia. They don't know how to fly anything. In fact, the Tyranni don't allow anybody that isn't themselves to learn how to fly. But Byron learned this stuff because he was on planet Earth, way outside the domain of the Tyranni, so he could go to school and be educated in space travel and things of that nature. He could pilot a ship and figure out how to do it. Kind of had to figure it out, but he knew enough basic knowledge to be able to put it all together and so forth. So it's they're on their way trying to Lingane, and he's kind of by himself, and Artemisia finally kind of started to mellow out and start wanting to get to know this young man who's helping her and her uncle, and wanders into the pilot room, and they talk a little bit, and do you think you know what you're doing? And he's kind of like, well, I'm not sure, and that actually reassures her. That's kind of nice. So she's talking to I know you can handle the ship. And Byron decided that maybe he might at that. Okay. Artemisia had tucked her legs under her and sat facing him. She said, I had an awfully queer sensation in the bunk, almost as if I were floating. That is one of the things that frightens me. Every time I'd turn, I gave a queer little jump into the air and flopped back slowly as if there were springs in the air holding me back. You were sleeping in the top bunk? Yes, the bottom ones give me claustrophobia, with another mattress only 6 inches over my head. Byron laughed, and that explains it. The ship's gravitational force is towards its base. It falls off as you move away from it. In the top bunk, you're probably 20 or 30 pounds lighter than on the floor. Were you ever on a passenger liner, a really big one? Once. My father and I visited Tehran last year. Well, on the liners, they have the gravitation in all parts of the ship directed towards the outer hull, so that the long axis of the ship is always up, no matter where you are. That's why the motors of one of those big ships are always lined up in a cylinder running right along the long axis. No gravity there. It must take an awful lot of power to keep an artificial gravity going, not enough to power a small town. There isn't danger of running out of fuel, is there? Don't worry about that. Ships are fueled by the total conversion of mass to energy. Fuel is the last thing we'll run out of. The outer hull will wear away first. She was facing him. He noted that her face was clean. Okay, now I'm back in something familiar. Now, in the what do you call it? Doubleday edition, 115, 116. That whole thing's there, and I'm not going to repeat it. But they added something that wasn't in here. And so she stopped him. I know you can handle the ship. Byron decided that maybe he could at that. Artemisia had tucked her long, unclad legs under her and sat facing him. She had only her filmy underclothes for cover, but seemed unconscious of the fact, though Byron was definitely not. She said, I had an awful queer sensation in the bunk, almost as if I were floating. She gives that whole long explanation, and all the way until the outer hole will wear away first. She was facing him. He noted that her face had been cleaned of her makeup. Okay. Now this is kind of a nice example of the kinds of chunks that get missed besides the whole chapter 5. In the Ace edition, well, you missed that whole explanation. Where is that? Let's see. Okay, I didn't get this number here. Okay, it's in here. Alright. Okay, yep, the same things. Okay. I know you can handle the ship. Byron decided maybe he could adapt. Artemisia had tucked her long, unclad legs under her, facing him. Was only that part's the same. Even though Byron was definitely not so effective, she was facing him. So that whole other dialogue about the her experiences in the bunk and why how the gravity is there and passenger plane craft were different. I'll do one more from the third part, and then I think that'll be it for the variations among the editions of the story. Now, this is in the third one, page 121, and I think this should be a fairly short thing. Well, I'm just gonna do the name of the chapter and first couple of paragraphs, and then you'll see how they kind of differ. Again, between the original Galaxy edition versus the Doubleday. I don't think there was any difference for the Ace or the newest one. Okay. Chapter 13, Out of the Jaws. That's the title chapter. So each chapter has titles. By the way, the Ace edition takes away all the titles for the chapters. So it's a little less noticeable that one of them is missing. And if they're all numbered off by one, beyond chapter 5. Okay. Artemisia watched them as they became tiny figures trudging up the bare granite, then dipping below and out of sight. For a moment, just before they disappeared, one of them had turned. She couldn't be sure which one, and for a moment her heart hardened. She said peevishly, "Uncle Gil, why did you close the ports? It's enough to freeze a person to death." Now, let's see how that goes inside the 71 172. Okay. So they're on the planet, the uninhabitable planet. Okay. Now, here they call it Out of the Jaws of Defeat, given that the next chapter is simply titled Defeat. In both cases, the defeat part's kind of redundant. Okay. Artemisia watched them as they became tiny figures trudging up the bare granite and dipping below and out of sight. For a moment, just before they disappeared, one of them had turned. She couldn't be sure which one, and for a moment her heart hardened. He had not said a word on parting. Not one word. She turned away from the sun and rock towards the confined metal interior of the ship. She felt alone, terribly alone. She had never felt so alone in her life, so there was actually more material here. It was that, perhaps, that made her shiver, but it would have been an intolerable confession of weakness to admit it wasn't simply the cold. She said peevishly, "Uncle Gil, Why don't you close the ports? It's enough to freeze a person to death. So, just a little sample there. So, it's interesting to see how these texts vary. But I've enjoyed that. But I like the story, and I love how it ends. Is there a rebellion world? Well, let's just say the autarch of Lingane has figured out there are 5 possible worlds with a little help from experience from Uncle Gil. And he's exploring. They go into the nebula. They're hidden inside the nebula. You can't see them. But he knows where they are. They've been located from way back when or something, and they figure out where they are and go right to them. And they go to 3 of them, nothing. They go to a 4th. There's a planet, an uninhabited planet I've mentioned a couple times here. They land. There's nothing there. Other events transpire. I won't spoil what those are. And there's still a 5th one, the coordinates of which, the autarch of the game have not yet shared with anybody. And that becomes a plot point, too. I will leave it at that. Anyway, I found it extremely enjoyable for myself. And only at the very end do we find out what the document is. Well, actually, I have spoiled that if you listen closely. That's what I have to say on that. It's a nice book. I've enjoyed it. I hope I get to cover the other Galactic Era novels so carefully. Thanks for listening.